Go ahead.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for stopping into our presentation today. We are going to be going over considerations for practice, specifically the sociocultural experiences of undocumented individuals. And my name is Hannah Perez. I am a graduate student in the Clinical Rehabilitation and Mental Health Counseling program at California State University, Fresno.
And again, welcome everyone. We appreciate your time, energy to be with us today as we talk about experiences of undocumented individuals in the United States. And I'm Dr. Yuleinys Castillo, and I'm an assistant professor at Fresno State in the same program as where Hannah is one of our students.
So by the end of our presentation, we hope that we will be able to enhance your understanding of the lived experiences of undocumented individuals, specifically in an American context. And we're also going to go over some of the social determinants that influence the quality of life of undocumented individuals. So we don't have time to go into everything that entails, but we'll cover a lot of the important ones. We'll also identify some really important mental health interventions that we can use to assist these individuals. And overall, we just hope to increase awareness of the lived experience of this population. So if anyone would like to either leave a comment in the chat or unmute themselves and kind of share with us in the group how you yourself define an undocumented individual. Would anyone like to share?
Or if you can use the chat option too, if you can share with us some of your interpretations, or how do you define an undocumented individual?
I would define an undocumented individual as someone who doesn't have the same rights and privileges as an American citizen and who has to fear not being able to stay or not being documented.
Yeah, those are really great and important points to bring up. Thank you for sharing, Lisa. Does anyone else have anything to share?
An undocumented individual is someone who does not have a permanent residency card, a visa, or an invitation, a temporary invitation to be in the boundaries of the United States.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Those are also really great points to bring up. So moving along, has anyone here actually had experience working with undocumented individuals? And if so, would you be comfortable sharing with the group how that went for you?
I was actually going to ask this in the chat. Would you consider a DACA recipient undocumented?
You know, that's a very great question, and we had that conversation about the DACA population, right? I think because when we're talking about DACA students, there is this when the previous presidency, they were in limbo for a period of years because of some executive orders that were signed, and if some of them did become undocumented, right? But the majority of them didn't lose the right to reside in the United States legally. Now, with the new president, we have seen a more support for these students. And at this point, they will be considered documented individuals, unless they're not paying the required fees. And of course, if they don't necessarily adhere to the expectations of being a DACA student, right? So let's say, for instance, let's say if they don't renew their application, or if they stop, or if they don't pay the fees that comes with that document or that privilege of having being a DACA student, they could become undocumented, if that makes sense. Great question, by the way.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I also see some people have commented in the chat that they have worked with undocumented youths before. Would anyone like to expand on that a little bit?
Sure. It was living in, whenever I was living in San Diego, worked for what used to be the Mexican Advisory Committee. And most of my coworkers were, had, crossed the border and were like, would be very honest, they were undocumented, but were documented. So they helped with youth programs, but they, yeah, so it was where it just became into problems because they didn't have social security numbers for like Toys for Tots, because I would have to do the paperwork for Toys for Tots for the particular group, and a lot of the kids didn't have them because they just didn't have them, but also GED tests, like whenever some of these kids would become wards of the state, whenever they tried to, they had dropped out of school, but they were wards of the state, so they were obviously documented. They just didn't have the right paperwork to do what they needed to get GED to, to graduate from high school.
Thank you so much for sharing. I really appreciate it. It's always good to hear from someone who has had an experience before, so thank you. Would anyone else like to share anything before we move on? Okay.
I do work with the undocumented population. I am located in New Jersey. I started a program where I work for a hospital system, health system, and it was a deterrent because if they had a headache, they would show up in the emergency room because they don't have a primary physician, right? So the hospital was losing lots of money. So it became a social determinant, and as well as a health disparity as well. So I proposed a plan to the president of the hospital, which he accepted and was given space. And it was just me, a nurse practitioner, and a nutritionist. But what I found out is that I quickly had to hire more staff to get a social worker, a psychologist on board, more nurses on board, because to actually deal with the entire person. It wasn't just that they had a headache. What we found out later was they had chronic illnesses like diabetes, hypertension, that they weren't paying attention to because they were really thinking about the more immediacies of homelessness or where is the next dinner going to come from. And so with that being said, we started treating them, doing mental health treatment for them. And we have data to show how much impactful it was, where their diabetes, their A1C levels would go down, their blood pressure levels would go down, because now they were treating the trauma. A lot of them showed up with trauma. And we start treating them, we saw the impact on their chronic illnesses as well as their mental illness.
Wow, yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. It's true, we're going to talk about health disparities that undocumented individuals have to deal with, and they do go to the ER more often because of, it's the most accessible thing. And let me just read some of the comments in the chat, because I know, Anila, your mic isn't working, but thank you for sharing. So you work with the population, and yeah, with that cross the borders by themselves, that must be really difficult. I can't imagine that it is rewarding to help those clients. And Mary, thank you for sharing as well. From a social worker's perspective, it's true that without documentation, it's hard for these individuals to qualify for programs and services that otherwise we could easily give our clients. So it can be frustrating at times. So thank you for sharing that.
I know we've talked a little bit about the definition, and I'll share with you what do we mean by undocumented individuals or non-citizen, which is also another way to describe this population. And it's any foreign-born individual who does not have a legal right to be in the United States. Again, we're talking specifically in the American context. Also, of course, these individuals enter the United States without inspection or proper permission from the government, or also it could be those who enter with a legal visa that is not longer valid. Also, of course, we, as we mentioned in the talking about the unaccompanied minors, some of them do cross the border or sneak across the border, but when we look at the data, the majority of them, they tend to overstay their visa. Now, of course, we have a definition by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and it's just another way. It's a definition provided by the government. You can go to the next slide.
Yeah, so as we talked about, there are multiple social determinants that affect the lived experiences of undocumented individuals, but there's also a lot of negative views and stigma towards undocumented individuals that also highly affects their quality of life. So I'm sure you've all heard a lot of myths before that the high crime rates are because there are too many undocumented people in the country, when we can actually see in this chart over here that a lot of the categories, the high crime rates are actually from US born citizens, and then legal immigrants, and undocumented actually have the least crime rates in all of these different categories. So just having that knowledge and information can help change the stigma around myths like this. And there's a big impact on our perception of immigrants. So again, just things like assuming that immigrants are basically inhumane in general, that they are not equal to us, they are lesser than us, when we are all human beings and we should be treated as equals regardless if we have our documentation or not. And another myth is they create a strain to the economy, they're stealing all of our jobs, they're increasing our tax money, when really undocumented immigrants contribute around $6 to $7 billion in Social Security funds annually, and they aren't even able to claim any of that money. So that's another big myth that we really need to debunk, because it's just not true at all. You know, the mere perception of having an illegal status alone is enough to place even legal immigrants and even US citizens at risk for discrimination in housing processes, hiring for employment, criminal profiling, and arrest by law enforcement, and even for public harassment and hate crimes in communities that they thought they could call their home. So really just the stigma that a lot of Americans hold is contributing super negatively to the mental health of this population.
And just to give you an example, or just so we can talk a little bit more about the impact of the stigma on the experiences of this population, a study that we found, they were talking about how this the impact of this ethnic-based inequalities, right? As if you can see, and this is a study that they did just comparing the experiences and the perceptions of individuals from individuals who identify as white Americans related to undocumented or immigrants from different background. And as you can see in this chart, there is some specific attributes associated with the Mexican or a Mexican immigrant compared to an immigrant who may be perceived as being, or even if they knew they came from Italy, right? So we can see how there is some judgment that is placed on an immigrant or as someone who's perceived as an immigrant just based on where they're coming from, or based on their ethnic background, or even their cultural, how they self-identify culturally speaking. However, at the same time, when we're thinking from a counseling perspective, we also want to keep in mind the social experiences of these individuals, right? And how the social perception that comes with, and the social reaction that comes with being perceived as someone being perceived as a Mexican immigrant compared to somebody who comes from Italy. At the same time, as we're talking about their lived experiences, and we also need to keep in mind the impact on hiring decisions, the impact or even college admissions, how that could affect their likelihood of being admitted to college. Also, their social relationships, social interaction with others, and also this is not only affecting immigrants, it also affects United States citizens, legal residents, legal individuals in the United States who are perceived as being Mexican or who are perceived to be from a specific ethnic group. And when that happens, they're also perceived as being illegal or being undocumented individuals, right? So this social illegality, it's applied or it's imposed on individuals just based on ethnic-based attributes as well. And it's therefore affecting not only the immigrant population that comes from a similar ethnic background, but also affecting legal residents of the United States, United States citizens, and how they're perceived by others in our society.
And so this map I included just kind of shows where undocumented immigrants are living in the United States as a whole. So there are really high populations in California and Texas and Florida and some other states along the East Coast. So there's approximately 12 million undocumented immigrants total that live in the United States. And around 45 million immigrants in total, whether they're undocumented or documented, that live in the United States. So, and kind of tying into what Dr. Castillo was saying in the previous slide, there's always an assumption that all undocumented individuals are from Mexico. They cross the border and come in here illegally, when really there's also a really high number of Indian undocumented immigrants that live in Northern California and like Los Angeles County area and throughout the United States. So again, just having the correct information and facts can really help us with our knowledge. Did you have anything to add to this, Dr. Castillo?
Nope, you did a really good job. Share with you some of the reasons why people may choose to come to the United States or they're brought to the United States, right? Different stories that our clients do bring to the table, but some of the reasons why they immigrate or their family brings them to the United States could be for difficult war-related situations, events, or just actually the results of a war that's taking place in their home country. They could come here for better opportunities, employment opportunities. Also, it could be for family reunification too. I just was watching the news last night or the day before, 2 days before, and they were talking about how 2 children, I know we do have a crisis in the border, and I know sometimes people don't want to call it a crisis, but it's a humanitarian crisis where 2 children were just dropped over the border fence so they could be reunited with their parents, right? A 3 and a 5-year-old children. They were just dropped over the fence by the smugglers so they could be reunited with the family. Of course, educational opportunities, that could be another reason why people may choose to come to the United States. And of course, having freedom of choice, freedom of religious preferences or expression of religious values. At the same time, sexual expressions or having the right to be married, just that sense. And of course, the United States is known as a country of freedom or having that right of freedom. So some individuals may also choose to come here for those reasons as well.
There's a big impact on family dynamics as well, as Dr. Castillo is kind of touching on. So there's at least 5.5 million children who have at least one undocumented parent, and of those, only 1 million of them are undocumented themselves. So being documented and having a parent that's undocumented causes a lot of feelings of guilt for the documented child, knowing that they don't have to live in as much fear as their parent. They can travel across the border and come back without fear. There's a lot of fear of family separation because of deportation. So maybe one day they'll wake up and their mom won't be able to live with them anymore. There's a fear of not being able to be reunited with their family, and just mixed documentation status in a family can be really stressful and make a big impact on the family dynamics and feeling comfortable living as a family together, not knowing if they'll be together any longer. There's also a lot of health disparities that undocumented individuals deal with, as we kind of touched on earlier. So there's a lot lower rates of this population having health insurance because that's mostly obtained through employment. But as we'll talk about, a lot of undocumented individuals don't have the best employment opportunities and probably won't be able to get health insurance through there. So because of that, they have less access to services, both physical and mental health. They usually won't have a primary care physician, which is why they tend to go to the ER more often. And that is really expensive. As I'm sure you all know, just going to the doctor with a primary physician is already expensive as is. So only being able to access the ER is really, it causes a huge strain on the family. And research has also shown that they do receive lower quality of care than US born citizens. So for diseases that would normally be easily treatable, like diabetes or like high blood pressure, it's harder for undocumented individuals to get over these and treat them. The quality of care just isn't the same. So now I'm going to play a quick video of the mental health tools that can be on an undocumented individual.
Now, I know that as a white undocumented person, I am not immediately the target of, law enforcement or ICE, but every time I organize or I fight back against the system, I'm putting myself more in a position to be targeted. It is scary.
Agle Marineskaite is a DACA recipient from Lithuania. When she was 6 years old, her parents illegally brought her along to the US to get away from Lithuania's then economic instability. She's been living in the Chicago area ever since. Keeping her story to herself for the better part of her teenage years, Marineskaite came out as an undocumented immigrant when she was 17.
I'm here today opening up about being undocumented and being someone who people don't assume is undocumented.
She's been extremely vocal about her story and about the mental health cost that she and other immigrants pay for living in fear of deportation.
I was talking to people all over Illinois, and every time, I was in front of a group of people, I was sharing my story of being undocumented. What's to say that someone in the audience or someone, in the general area could be an ICE agent, be friends with an ICE agent, and just tip them off. When I'm organizing or I'm at a protest and I'm surrounded, by my comrades and by the people I know who will be there for me, I feel safer. But when I'm just living my life and kind of navigating the world and I'm alone, I think that's when the paranoia creeps in.
Marineskaite says her paranoia got out of hand last summer when news about ICE raids and deportations surged.
I would be driving on the highway, for example, and I'd be listening to the radio, and I felt like the radio was singing to me. And when I looked on the billboards and just all around me, I thought I was getting messages that my life was in danger, that I was a danger to myself, maybe to other people. And it terrified me because I felt like I was being spoken to by some kind of force. eventually I was in a position to like call an ambulance on myself. I had like completely lost touch with reality. While I was at that ward, I was diagnosed with general anxiety disorder and then post-traumatic stress disorder. I could put a name to what I was experiencing. Since then, I've just been trying to, be as honest with my experiences with people as possible, because I know that mental health is so stigmatized.
While harsh immigration policies are not the only factors behind the distress that Yuleinys Kaite and many undocumented immigrants live with, they can make things worse.
Many immigrants fled their countries of origin.
Okay, so I'm going to stop the video here because we have an activity planned for the end and I want to move on. But this video is really impactful to me because I'm a victim of, a bias that a lot of immigrants are, maybe they look like they're foreign. They aren't European. So this was a good example of she saying like, I don't have to live in as much fear as other undocumented individuals. So that really stood out to me a lot.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this constant fear. And we saw in the video the impact that may have on some undocumented individuals, and how being under this constant fear that they may be deported or somebody may find out that they're undocumented could lead to toxic stress, and could also, of course, lead to other mental health issues. At the same time, of course, as we're thinking about the mental health toll that this fear may have on the individuals, our clients, we also want to keep in mind that this population is struggling or dealing with poor access to health care. Right, so you may be working with an individual who's struggling with mental health issues related to this fear of deportation, but yet they don't have access to proper mental health services. At the same time, there is also and as you can see, all of these issues are interconnected, intertwined. The social economic background, I will talk about employment in just one second. Of course, in some cases, they may have limited English proficiency, meaning that they may have access to the services, but yet they might not speak English well enough to understand, or they might not know how to express who they are or how they are feeling in their in English, right? So having access to providers who speak their native language also could be challenging. At the same time, something that we haven't mentioned, and it's also very important to keep in mind, it's the state that we're working at, right? The local federal policies that do affect access to healthcare. And depending where you're practicing, your clients may have your undocumented clients may have access to more services than in other areas of the country. So it's also something very important for us to be mindful of, have an understanding of any funded healthcare services in your communities and how they may actually provide services to undocumented individuals. It's something that could be helpful if you're working with this population, or if or if you're a member of an organization, or if you somehow are very active in your community, just having an understanding which agencies in my area do provide services to this population is also something that can be very helpful. Even getting a driver license, as you know, in many cities and towns in the United States, transportation, as a society, we don't necessarily rely on public transportation. It's actually, we're in a society that's very much and we do value independency, and that independency comes with having your own vehicle. However, for some undocumented individual, it's very difficult, or it's impossible actually in some cases, to obtain a driver license. They may be able to drive, they do have the ability to drive, however, they don't have a license. So you can imagine how stressful that could be, just driving from your home to work, and the likelihood or the possibility of being pulled over and being asked to show your driver license. And of course, also they pay higher automobile insurance as well in some states than an individual who has a driver license. Oh, human trafficking is another issue that's affecting this population. Sometimes they do come to the United States. They are deceived into coming into the United States with a promise of employment, with multiple promises, but in the reality, they become a victim of human trafficking. It's also something that may happen to this population that also adds to the constant fear. And of course, toxic stress. The toxic stress does come with this fear of deportation. And research has shown that it could have, we saw in the video as well, it could have very harmful effects on the individual, not only from a mental health perspective, but also physically, right? Also, this toxic stress affects the whole family dynamic. It affects the parents, the adults in the family, but also the children as well. Somebody mentioned earlier the idea of trauma, right? And trauma is definitely trauma associated with immigration or associated with this fear of deportation. It's also something that you definitely want to address in your counseling sessions, and being mindful of the impact of this fear and the impact of non-medical services and how they could have an impact on the general well-being of your clients.
And so looking at employment, as we know, employment is highly valued in American society. One of the first questions we ask someone is, oh, what do you do for a living? Like, that's how we get to know people. And a lot of undocumented individuals do come to the United States for better employment opportunities. However, they really have less than ideal options or access to good jobs. And because of this, they're often paid much less than minimum wage. Many individuals are working in the fields. They get paid with cash or under the table so that they can get paid less than other employees. And just in general, the work conditions are not good. And a lot of undocumented individuals will not or are afraid to speak up in the work environment because they fear if they do, they might get turned in by their employer for, acting out or speaking up. And so some actions that we can take as clinicians to help this population is to shift our terminology that we use and really challenge the stigma that exists in society. So instead of referring to these individuals as illegal or illegal aliens, referred to them as undocumented individuals. There's no negative connotations with that. It's not discriminatory, and illegal in general is just not a proper term to refer to a human being. There's also some federal memos and immigration reform bills that are occurring right now in our government. So it was proposed that we change the term illegal alien to non-citizen. So this is a really big deal to see that some reform is happening at higher levels. And this is a really good first step. So now it's our job, to advocate even more and push for more changes in systems. So that involves like being multiculturally competent and having social justice as one of your main goals as a clinician. And at the end of the day, just treating these undocumented individuals as human beings and really listen to them and their experiences will help a lot. And so these are some appropriate interventions that have been found across research when working with this population. So short-term therapies are really helpful because, again, there's always that constant fear of being deported. So we might need to make some plans that have goals, so solution focus, things that can happen quickly. And also a lot of undocumented individuals have to work many hours, usually 10 to 12 hours a day to support themselves and their families. So they don't have a lot of extra time. We want to assess the client's level of acculturation, so how much they've, kind of taken up the US culture and the importance of their culture of origin to them. Group counseling can also be really helpful because it provides them with like a social support system, and hearing experiences of other individuals that are similar to them makes them feel heard and validated with what they're going through. Involving the family is really important because the US is really individualistic, but a lot of other cultures are very collectivist, especially those who are undocumented. They really would like their family to be involved in decisions and treatment. So it's important to involve the family. Mindfulness has also been shown to work really well, and just multicultural therapeutic approaches in general.
And also, of course, each of our clients, they bring a very unique perspective to our sessions. And when you're working with this population and just thinking from that multicultural perspective, just keeping in mind, how can you focus on their strength, right? And how can you use the strengths-based approach to understand what are some of the qualities that they're bringing to the session, but not only to the session, even beyond to society. At the same time, we've talked a little bit about this fear, but also from a counseling perspective, we need to build this a space of trust. Like, trust building is very crucial for this population, so they can open up and actually share with you that they're undocumented. For this population, even especially when they're younger, individuals who are undocumented, it becomes like a very important secret that they don't want to share with people. Meaning the secret of them being undocumented, and they are comfortable just sharing it with people that they truly trust. And in some cases, that's only their parents or their siblings or their very close family members, right? Because they've been living with this fear of deportation, and again, all the implications that we mentioned earlier, that it's very difficult for them to open up to people and say, I do not have legal documentation. So building this sense of trust is crucial when working with this population. Also recognize the coping skills. As you can imagine, navigating all the different systems that we have to as an individual, educational system, medical system, and the list goes on and on and on. Just recognize those coping skills, right? And also adjusting to a different culture. And even if they came here as a younger individual, if they came here when they were a baby, or they came here when they were very young, they still have coping skills that had allowed them to adjust to living with their family here, living with their, or if they're not necessarily with their parents, just living with family members or friends, right? Because again, there are so many different stories. Just recognizing some of the coping skills that they have. Also, and again, there are other areas that we wanted to present to you today, but the positive being an immigrant. Research has shown that immigrants, documented and undocumented, generally speaking, they tend to be healthier. They tend to have a more positive outlook in life than United States citizens. And also they have a strong sense of resilience. They, again, adjust into a new country, that the acculturation process that happens as well. And of course, as Hannah was mentioning, some of them do work 10 to 12 hours a day, right? So they do have a very strong work ethic that translate to them being excellent employees. And of course, we also recognize that that's not necessarily something that applies to all of the undocumented individuals that you may encounter. But it's important for us as provider to also recognize the positive attributes that comes with that experience, the positive attributes that comes with experience of being an undocumented individual.
So now as a group, we wanted to kind of unpack everything we've talked about and look at a case study of working with an undocumented individual. So I'll go ahead and read it. So Sarah, the client, came to the United States from the Philippines as a child with her mother, Nicole. Neither Sarah nor Nicole have legal status here. Sarah is now 14 years old. She attends school regularly and has never had any contact with immigration authorities. 6 months ago, Sarah's mother's new boyfriend moved into the home. 3 months ago, he started making sexual advances towards Sarah. Sarah's grades plummeted and she started missing school. When the school counselor reached out to Sarah, she learned what had been happening. So I guess let's all put ourselves in the perspective of this school counselor who had just found out all of this. What are some of everyone's first impressions or first steps they think they would take if they were handed this case with Sarah? You can go ahead and type in the chat or unmute yourself to share. So Lisa mentioned maybe contacting CPS. That's a really good point. If there's some possible sexual abuse going on in the home and the mother is aware of it, she might be unfit as the mother. Does anyone else have any thoughts they would like to share?
And that's a very good point too. Definitely this, and I know just also thinking about the implications for the mom, but definitely find a way to report this abuse that's taking place, so we can protect Sarah and even potentially the mom, because if the mom, we don't know if the mom knows, but it's important for the mom to become aware of that too, definitely. And we have more in the chat. I can see how somebody mentioned the idea of how it's great that it's kudos to Sarah for trusting the school counselor. And then again, that shows that Sarah has felt comfortable enough to share that with a counselor, right? Anila mentioned that in New York, she will call CPS and secure Sarah's safety. And again, somebody agreed with CPS as well for the safety of the child. And that's true. Like we mentioned, right? The mom might just not know what is happening, right? Validating, yes, we talked about strength-based counseling, right? Validating Sarah's courage to trust the school social worker or the counselor, as mentioned, previously by Bryant, is a very good point. And of course, again, considering, keeping in mind how they could both be living in fear of deportation if reporting the abuse. And that's a very good point. And it also goes back to this idea of educating our clients, because there is a legislation in place when we're thinking about this path to citizenship or path to legal status in the United States. A victim of abuse, actually, they become eligible to residency, legal residency in the United States, right? So educating Sarah and her mom on how this could potentially lead to them becoming legal in the United States because they've been a victim of a type of abuse. Right, so that could help to decrease the fear of deportation, but also it's very important to educate them, however, that and recognize the fear that they may have associated with deportation if they report the abuse, but at the same time, help them recognize also the values of sharing and opening up and properly investigating this case. Very good, great points. Anybody else, anything else?
Yeah, someone also put in the chat, knowing the status of the boyfriend could also be helpful. That's a really good point. That could impact a lot of things too. Yeah. Anything to add to that, Dr. Castillo?
That's a very good point. And of course, we don't have enough, but it makes me think also about, because of course, like I mentioned, this fear of deportation also leads to others abusing or manipulating undocumented individuals. So there is, I mean, we don't know yet, but we could also may want to know that, and also maybe even ask more questions, because what if the boyfriend is manipulating the call, right? Or what if the boyfriend knows that they're undocumented and that's how he's living with them, or how that he's taking advantage of who they are. So asking more questions and trying to have a better understanding about the boyfriend status, the boyfriend intentions, that could be very helpful as well. And this could be just thinking about just neglect and abuse in general, working with an individual who has been a victim of abuse, applying all those principles, all the questions that you may want to ask to understand what is going on in this household, and understand what type of abuse is happening and understand more of how can I go about working with this family. That's a very good point.
Yeah, well, thank you everyone so much for your contributions and for sharing. Does anyone have any general questions for us, whether related to the case or anything that we talked about this afternoon?
Hi, this is Jackie. I have a question for both of you. I'm curious, having heard Dr. Castillo mention that sometimes one of the strengths of undocumented individuals, have to learn to say that more often, is their community and their trust for each other. What's the likelihood that in this situation with Sarah and her mom, that both of them, or even mom mainly, because mom has a lot of influence on Sarah, what's the likelihood that mom will actually be honest about what's going on in the home if she's fearful of being deported or Nicole being deported? I've gotten the names confused, but yeah, that's my question. What's the likelihood that they'll actually be honest about their situation?
Yeah, thank you for asking, Jackie. That's a really good point. And honestly, the likelihood might be pretty low, considering their undocumented status, and like how everyone was saying, the fear of deportation might, honestly, as hard as it sounds to hear, like outweigh everything else that's going on. It's kind of pick one of your battles and which one is going to be, you know, most beneficial as of right now. And it's really sad to hear that, but it's true that Nicole might not be likely to confess to what's going on.
And that's a very good point too. And as a provider, that's why that sense of trust, it's very critical. In this case, of course, we do see how the school counselor reached out to Sarah, but even Sarah might not necessarily want to open up to the school counselor yet. It might take a while for her to trust the school counselor to tell her all the different details associated with the case. So that's a very good point. And again, because they might be concerned on how or the consequences of disclosing.
We also have a question in the chat asking, how often do religious organizations assist with undocumented individuals such as Sarah? And that's a really good question. Maybe Dr. Castillo, you want to expand on this a little bit more, but I know religion can be a very big support system for a lot of undocumented individuals.
That's a very good point. Religious organizations, they do, depending, of course, on the community that you're practicing in, even the state, but they usually do have some type of assistance for undocumented individuals. We've seen different religious entities providing services or even support to individuals who are undocumented. That's a very good, and if I were you, I highly encourage you to identify those organizations in your community, because they tend to be very welcoming, and they also tend to provide different services to individuals regardless of their documented status. In fact, many or most, I don't want to say all of them because I'm not sure, but most religious entities won't ask you for your legal status to welcome you to their community. Very good question.
this is Lacey, I can say something too, working in school districts or, within schools, they have, schools sometimes are very supportive too, because they have somebody who tracks the transient kids who are, coming across, going to different schools who are probably illegal. So they, they make sure they provide support, supports for those kids too, because very often what happens is they go from state to state. So it affects their school attendance because, they disappear. And so schools track them, but they, they don't, how can I say, they support them, but they want to make sure they provide support and know, what happens to those kids who disappear.
And that's a very great point, because sometimes the schools just don't even know how to find them or how to keep track of the students, undocumented students who have disappeared, or the undocumented students who are not coming back to school. That's a very good point too.
Right. Well, thank you everyone again so much for coming to our presentation. We really appreciate it. I've put our email addresses in the chat if you all ever have any questions and would like to reach out to us. So we'll go ahead and let you all get going now, so you have some transition time if you have any other presentations you're attending next hour, any meetings. So thank you again, everyone, and we hope you have a great day.
Thank you so much for joining us.